Her granddaughter said, "She always overstays her welcome," loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Margaret Cole, widow and grandmother of 5, didn't blink. Sophie, the granddaughter she'd once welcomed every summer, thought the insult would fade. By morning, the deed to the lake house and the keys would be in Margaret's possession alone. She'd been both grandmother and host, now she was the guardian of her own peace. And when Sophie came back for what she thought was hers, the locked door would speak for her. I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. The envelope lay on the doormat like an afterthought, pale against the dark wood. Annabelle noticed it as she came in from pruning the rose bushes, her gloves still damp with soil. Her name, written in a looping calligraphy she didn't recognize, felt almost performative. Daniel's fiancé's touch, she guessed. She peeled it open at the kitchen counter, the kettle hissing behind her. The heavy cardstock smelled faintly of perfume. Her eyes skimmed past the gilt lettering, announcing the union of Daniel James Parker and Marissa Claire Whitmore, until they caught on a small italic line near the bottom. Guests are kindly requested to dress modestly for the occasion. The words tightened something in her chest. Not formal attire, not cocktail wear. Dress modestly. This wasn't etiquette, it was instruction. Annabelle set the card down as if it might stain her fingers. She leaned on the counter, letting the steam from the kettle fog her glasses. In all her 68 years, no one had dared tell her how to present herself. Not her parents, not Robert, her late husband. And now her own son's wedding invitation presumed to dictate it. Her mind flickered through decades. Daniel at 8, chocolate ice cream smeared across his cheeks. Daniel at 17, sulking after failing his driving test. Daniel at 25, Marissa's first Thanksgiving at the house. Her hand clamped over Daniel's as if to mark territory. That was when the distance began. Invitations dwindled. Conversations shortened. Seating arrangements shifted until she was at the far end of the table, too far to hear the jokes. She could never decide if Marissa disliked her for speaking her mind, or for knowing Daniel's life before Marissa existed in it. She carried her tea to the sunroom, where the winter light pooled pale and thin across the carpet. The invitation sat heavy in her lap, as she tried to imagine the intent behind that italicized request. Did they think she would embarrass them? Or was it an attempt to erase her, to make her blend into the wallpaper? The thought sparked a slow, steady heat inside. She had hosted dinners for 30 without breaking a sweat, managed a household and a business alongside Robert. She'd never learned to shrink herself for someone else's comfort, and she wasn't about to start now. Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf, to the small wooden box on the top shelf. She hadn't opened it in years. Rising, she slid it forward, dust stirring in the air. It was heavier than she remembered. She carried it to her chair and undid the brass latch with a soft click. Inside were the papers that had once defined her and Robert's life together. On top lay the title deed to the house, Robert's bold, certain signature beside hers. Her fingertip traced the ink. The memory came rushing back. The two of them in the lawyer's office, hands clasped under the table while the papers slid across to sign. That house wasn't just real estate. It was their stake in the world, their proof of perseverance. Annabelle's eyes shifted to the wedding invitation on the side table. They wanted her modest, invisible, but Robert's signature in her hands told another story, one of presence, of worth, of unshakable belonging. Her lips curved, not in amusement but in decision. She would attend the wedding. She would not fade into the background, and she would bring with her a piece of Robert and the life they had built. Annabelle closed the box gently, her mind already shaping the moment. When she walked into that wedding, she wouldn't just carry herself. She'd carry the title deed and Robert's signature and the unspoken reminder of exactly who she was. I wasn't going to let them dictate who I was. My late husband's legacy would speak louder than any morning light slanted through the bedroom blinds, carving thin gold stripes across the cedar floor. Annabelle stood in front of the open closet, her arms crossed, eyes scanning the rows of neatly hung garments. There were dresses she hadn't worn in years, sleek navy silk from a charity gala, a cream suit from Robert's retirement dinner, a crimson sheath that always made her feel like she was walking into a room 10 feet tall. She pulled out the cream suit first, holding it against her frame in the mirror. Respectable, safe, exactly what Marissa might expect. It lasted in her hands all of 10 seconds before she slid it back into place. She tried the navy gown next, smoothing its satin against her hip. It was elegant, but whispered apology instead of authority. Back it went, her gaze snagged on the crimson. The color was unapologetic, a low, steady pulse in the sea of neutrals. She ran her palm over the fabric, remembering Robert's eyes lighting up the first time she wore it. "That's my Annie," he'd said that night, his hand warm at the small of her back. She could almost feel that touch now, urging her forward. On the dresser sat the wooden box from the day before, still unopened since she'd placed it there last night. She set the crimson dress aside and crossed to it, lifting the lid once more. The title deed and Robert's signature lay inside, as certain and uncompromising as they had decades ago. She remembered the lawyer's office vividly, Robert's hand finding hers under the table, his thumb tracing a slow arc across her skin as the papers slid forward. They'd walked out into the cold January air that day knowing they'd secured more than a house. They'd secured proof of what two people could build from nothing. Annabelle folded the deed with care and slid it into the inner pocket of her handbag. She tucked Robert's signature, a clipped page from an old letter, into a slim leather card case. Not just keepsakes, not just sentiment, these were her armor. She turned back to the closet, pulled the crimson dress free, and laid it across the bed. A pearl necklace followed, then her black leather heels polished to a quiet gleam. She didn't need excess sparkle. She needed presence. Every choice was deliberate. Down to the deep plum polish she unscrewed and began brushing onto her nail. As the polish dried, her eyes drifted to the framed photograph on her nightstand, her and Robert on the porch of the house, a bottle of champagne between them, the sold sign leaning at a crooked angle in the yard. She'd been younger then, but the smile she wore in that photo, that mixture of triumph and ownership, was the same one she felt tugging at her mouth now. By the time the sun began to dip, she was ready, dress steamed, bag packed, the weight of the deed and signature like a quiet heartbeat against her side. But there was one more thing to do. She picked up the phone and dialed Lucy's number from memory. Her friend answered on the second ring, voice warm with surprise. "What's got you calling this late?" Annabelle told her everything. The invitation, the italicized dress modestly, the box on the shelf, the plan forming in her mind. Lucy listened without interruption, but Annabelle could hear the small sharp intakes of breath on the other end. When she finished, Lucy let out a low whistle. "You've got some fire in you," she said. "But Annie, you know they're not going to take this lightly. You walk in there like that, you're not just making a statement, you're starting a war." Annabelle smiled faintly into the receiver. "Then it's about time someone did." Lucy's voice dropped to a murmur, the kind she used when delivering hard truths. "Be careful. This could be a lot more complicated than you think." The day had arrived, and I felt a mixture of excitement and defiance in the air. The drive to the Whitmore estate curved through manicured gardens that looked like they'd been painted into place. Perfect hedges, rose beds in measured bloom, fountains flanked by marble cherubs. Even the gravel paths seemed arranged to crunch at the same polite volume beneath expensive shoes. The cab stopped before tall wrought iron gates. They opened with silent precision, admitting her into a world that had been staged down to the last blade of grass. The house loomed ahead, all pale stone and gleaming windows, the kind of architecture meant to impress from the first glance. As Annabelle stepped out, the late winter breeze tugged at the hem of her crimson dress. She let it. Movement was part of her entrance. The bag at her side carried the weight of the title deed and Robert's signature, pressing like a heartbeat against the leather. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and polished silver. A reception hall opened before her, swathed in white drapery and candlelight. Towering arrangements of orchids and roses anchored tables set with gold-rimmed china. A string quartet played in the corner, every note clipped and careful. Daniel spotted her first. He broke from a group of groomsmen, crossing the room with that half-measured stride of someone who wasn't sure whether to hug or shake hands. He settled on the briefest of embraces, palmless, perfunctory. "You made it," he said, voice neutral, eyes already scanning past her. "I said I would," she answered, steady. Marissa appeared moments later, her ivory gown catching the chandelier light in slow ripples. Her smile was wide but hollow, landing somewhere near Annabelle's cheek before slipping away. "So glad you could join us," she said, the words smooth but empty. "Wouldn't miss it," Annabelle replied, and meant it, though not the way Marissa thought. They drifted away without ceremony, swallowed by their bridal party. Annabelle stood still for a beat, letting the room show itself to her. Every candle was in its exact place, every chair draped in satin, every glass filled to the same perfect line. A grand statement, yet somehow, she wasn't part of it. Not in the design, not in the story. Her place card led her halfway down the aisle, between distant cousins and near strangers. From here she could see the altar clearly, but not the unspoken glances between bride and groom. She was present, yet placed apart, a polite exile. She sat, smoothing the skirt of her dress, feeling the slip of leather beneath her palm. The papers were there. The ink was there. Robert's hand on the deed, his legacy. Her claim was there. A bell chimed softly, and the quartet shifted into the slow anticipatory melody that called people to stillness. Guests lowered themselves into chairs. The air shifted with the hum of expectation. Annabelle let her breath settle. She had been to enough weddings to know this moment, when the world narrows to a single aisle, and every pair of eyes moves as one. The first bridesmaid appeared, her steps perfectly timed to the music. Murmurs faded to nothing. Somewhere behind the arch of white roses, Daniel waited. Marissa would join him in moments. Vows would be exchanged. Rings slipped on. Futures decided. Annabelle's fingers curled around the edge of her bag. She could feel the crisp outline of the title deed, the faint indentation of Robert's signature through the paper. The wedding ceremony began, and I wondered if I could stand by and watch as my legacy was swept aside once again. I walked into that room with one purpose in mind, to remind them who I really am. From her seat halfway down the aisle, Annabelle had the perfect view of everything, and of nothing that belonged to her. Rows of guests leaned forward in unison, their eyes fixed on Marissa as she glided toward Daniel, the lace of her veil catching in the soft candlelight. Every movement seemed choreographed for admiration. Annabelle might as well have been part of the decor, another ornament in the carefully arranged tableau. Even the string quartet's lilting cadence seemed to swell in Marissa's favor. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink more than necessary. She let the stillness settle over her like a second skin, watching the exchange unfold with a gaze that was steady but narrowing. The officiant's voice droned in its ceremonial rhythm, the words almost blurring together until one phrase pierced through, "I now pronounce you." Something in her chest tightened, not grief, not jealousy, something older. A refusal to vanish. Her fingers found the smooth leather of her bag, and the crisp fold of paper inside. Annabelle rose. The scrape of her chair legs broke the symmetry of the moment. Heads turned, some with curiosity, some with faint annoyance. She stepped into the aisle, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step deliberate. Conversations, or the murmurs pretending not to be conversations, fluttered in her wake. By the time she reached the front, Daniel's smile had faltered into a puzzled half-expression. Marissa's hand gripped his arm just slightly tighter. The officiant paused, brows knitting as if a page of the script had gone missing. Annabelle stopped beside them, close enough to see the fine tremor in Marissa's diamond earring. From her bag she withdrew the folded title deed. The heavy cardstock had been handled and rehandled over the decades, but Robert's signature remained bold, certain, unyielding. She placed it on the linen-covered table beside the officiant's book, the sound of paper on cloth louder than it should have been in that hushed room. Then came the second item, a small card case, from which she drew the clipped page bearing Robert's name in his familiar, confident hand. She set it directly atop the deed. A ripple went through the crowd, a soft collective intake of breath. "This," she said, her voice even but carrying, "is not just my inheritance. This is my family's legacy." Silence deepened, the kind that pulls the oxygen from the room. Somewhere near the back, a champagne flute clinked faintly against its neighbor, and then even that sound seemed to retreat. What no one in the room yet knew except Annabelle was that the deed and Robert's signature weren't mere symbols. They were the original, binding documents, granting her sole control over the family estate, untouched by the later revisions Daniel and Marissa had relied on. In legal terms, it meant everything. Daniel's jaw tightened. Marissa's eyes darted from the papers to the guests, then to Daniel, calculating whether to reach for them, to deny them, or to pretend they weren't there at all. Annabelle didn't flinch. She let the moment expand, the truth of her presence taking up more space than any instruction on a wedding invitation ever could. The officiant's hands hovered uncertainly above his book. He glanced toward Daniel for direction, but Daniel gave no. Somewhere in the front row a relative whispered, "Is that?" and the rest of the sentence was swallowed by the weight in the air. Annabelle took a single step back, but kept her chin lifted, as though she'd just placed the final piece in a long-planned arrangement. She did not explain further. She didn't need to. Around her, the room seemed to exist in two currents. The rigid formality of a ceremony, still technically in motion, and the chaotic undercurrent of eyes meeting, questions forming, positions being taken. Daniel's face turned pale, and Marissa looked nervously toward the guests. Annabelle could feel the tension in the air. The room went silent, and for a moment, I felt like I had won, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. The officiant didn't speak. The string quartet faltered, a violin note hanging awkwardly in the air before it died. The silence pressed against the walls, the kind that isn't really silent, tiny fragments of sound bleeding through a cough, the creak of someone shifting in their seat, the faint rustle of silk. Daniel's eyes locked on her, hard and cold, his lips barely moving. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, each word clipped like he was cutting wire. Annabelle didn't answer. She let the weight of the papers on the table speak for her, the sharp black of Robert's signature standing against the white. The officiant glanced between them, unsure whether to resume or abandon ship, but Daniel gave a tiny shake of his head, and the man stepped back. Marissa's expression, tight and carefully composed a moment earlier, slipped just enough for Annabelle to catch the edge of fury. Her mouth pressed into a thin line, eyes narrowing with the precision of someone deciding whether to lash out now or later. Annabelle turned without a word and walked back to her seat. Each step was unhurried. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't apologize with her body language. She sat, crossing one leg over the other, the crimson fabric pooling elegant. For the smallest heartbeat, she felt it, the sweet, rare sense of having shifted the ground beneath someone else's feet. She had reminded them she could not be erased, but beneath that satisfaction was the sharper knowledge they would not let this go. Across the aisle a few guests exchanged glances. Others avoided her eyes entirely, staring instead at the flowers, the ceiling, the floor, anywhere but at the woman who had just rewritten the energy in the room. From the edge of the second row, Marissa glanced back at her over her shoulder. No words passed, but the look was its own declaration. "You've crossed a line." Then came Ethan. He stood from his place near the back, tall, silver-haired, the kind of relative who showed up for weddings and funerals and little else, and crossed to her row. He bent slightly, his voice pitched low enough not to carry. "Annabelle," he said, "what was that about?" She let the question hang between them, considering. Finally she spoke, steady, unshaken. "That," she said, "was the truth. And the truth has its place." Even he studied her, eyes sharp as though trying to decide whether she was bluffing. "You may have just lit a fuse you can't put out," he murmured. Annabelle tilted her chin toward the front, then let it burn. The rest of the ceremony was a fractured shadow of its. The vows were rushed, the rings exchanged with tight smiles. Applause followed, polite and perfunctory, the sound of people clapping because they were supposed to. At the reception she felt the shift in the air, conversations bending away from her as she approached, laughter dimming when she passed. She caught snippets, her name in a half-whisper, the word deed, like a sharp pebble in the flow of polite chatter. Daniel avoided her entirely. Marissa made a point of greeting every table but hers. She didn't chase them. Instead she sipped her champagne and let the discomfort ferment. By the time the cake was cut, The distance between her and the bridal couple had become part of the scenery, a quiet fissure running straight through the celebration. When the last toast had been made and the dance floor opened, Ethan found her again. He motioned toward a quiet corner away from the music and chatter. She followed. He didn't waste time. "You've made a dangerous move," he said, his voice even, but the weight behind it unmistakable. Annabelle looked at him, seeing not just concern, but something else, knowledge. And for the first time that day, she wondered if the fight she'd started might be bigger than she realized. Ethan's warning lingered in my mind, but I wasn't ready to back down now. The music from the reception bled into the hallway, muffled by the thick paneled doors. In here the air was cooler, quieter, stripped of the polite applause and forced laughter outside. Ethan leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable, but his posture angled toward her like he was bracing for a blow. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, no preamble this time. His voice had lost the low courtesy he'd used at the table. It was harder now, like stone under velvet. Annabelle folded her arms, the crimson sleeve catching the light. "I reminded them of the truth, that's all." His eyes flicked toward the ballroom doors as though to make sure no one was listening. "Marissa's family, they have a legal claim to the estate. You waving that deed around might have just handed them leverage." She stilled. "There's a clause in Robert's old property agreements, one her uncle's firm could exploit if they wanted to. And after today?" He shook his head. "They'll want to." She didn't move, didn't even shift her weight. The words landed but didn't penetrate. "So be it," she said finally. "The will stands. And I will fight for it." Ethan exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between a sigh and a warning. "Daniel's furious, Annabelle. He's already talking about revising the will. I don't know who's been in his ear, but he's not going to play fair." Her gaze didn't waver. "Neither will I." A flicker of something respect maybe passed through his features, quickly shuddered. "Just know the ground you're standing on. It's not as solid as you think." She let that hang in the air for a moment, then brushed past him toward the end of the hall. The corridor's runner muffled her steps, but she could still feel the pulse of the reception beyond the doors, the throb of bass and clink of glasses. She didn't rejoin it. Not yet. Instead, she slipped out through a side exit, the cold evening air rushing up against her skin. The estate's gardens stretched ahead, lanterns strung through sculpted hedges casting pools of amber light on the gravel paths. She walked without hurry, letting her heels grind the stones into small declarations with every step. Her mind was already moving past Ethan's warning, threading through possibilities like a seamstress testing strong thread. If Marissa's family thought they could corner her with legalities, she'd match them with her own. She knew Robert's paperwork better than anyone alive. She'd been there for every signature, every clause. There were angles they didn't know she knew. Somewhere near the fountain, the music faded to nothing, replaced by the distant laughter of guests inside. She could picture Daniel smiling for photographs, whispering to Marissa, casting glances toward the empty chair where she should have been. Good. Let him notice the space she took up, even in absence. By the time she circled back to the parking area, her resolve had crystallized. The pressure was real, yes, but it was the kind that shaped diamonds. She would secure her legacy, not just in ink and paper, but in the way she carried it into every room. The driver opened the car door, and as she slid into the leather seat, she spotted something on the floor by her feet, a plain envelope, unmarked. She frowned, picking it up. Inside, a single sheet of heavy stock, no greeting, no signature, just a short typed line. "There are things about Robert's will you don't know." Her grip tightened on the paper. No return address, no sender, just the cold certainty that someone, maybe friend, maybe enemy, was watching her every move. The letter arrived, and inside it was a thread I hadn't anticipated, one that could unravel everything. The words sat on the page like a quiet detonation. "There are things about Robert's will you don't know." Annabelle read it again, slower this time, as if a second pass might reveal the missing pieces, a smudge, an initial, something human that could tell her who had sent it. But there was nothing. No folds in the paper beyond the one she'd made opening the envelope. No scent of ink, just the machine-stamped neutrality of the typed line. She slipped it back into the envelope and sat still in the back seat, the hum of the engine blurring into the sound of her own pulse. If this was meant to rattle her, it was working, though not in the way the sender might have hoped. She wasn't panicked, she was calculating. By the time the driver pulled up to her gate, she'd made up her mind. She didn't even take off her coat before picking up the phone and dialing Maurice Keating, Robert's old lawyer, the one man she trusted to tell her the truth without trimming it into something palatable. He answered on the fourth ring, voice rough with fatigue. "Annabelle, it's I've had a letter," she said. "Anonymous. It claims there are other things in Robert's will, things I don't know about." A pause on the line, and then the shift in his tone, alert, careful. "Do you still have it?" "I do." "Good. Don't destroy it. Don't dismiss it, either." She paced the kitchen as he spoke, her fingers trailing over the familiar ridges in the marble countertop. Maurice asked questions, how it was delivered, what the paper felt like, whether there were any identifying marks. When she told him there weren't, he went quiet for a long moment. "Annabelle," he said finally, "if there is another will, it changes everything. Even if it's invalid, the challenge alone could tie up the estate for years." Her hand tightened around the receiver. "So find out if there is one. I want every document Robert ever signed, every draft, every addendum, all of it." "That will take time," he warned, "and if someone's gone to the trouble of keeping it from you, they'll fight to keep it hidden." She almost smiled. "Then they've underestimated me." After hanging up, she stood at the kitchen window, watching the frost creep across the grass under the moonlight. It wasn't lost on her that this letter could have come from anyone. Daniel, Marissa, someone in Marissa's family, even a relative of her own she hadn't thought about in years. The circle of trust was shrinking, and with it her patience. The next morning, she hand-delivered the envelope to Maurice's office. His secretary tried to take it from her, but Annabelle shook her head. "Put it directly into his hands," she said, and the woman did. On the drive back, her thoughts moved like chess pieces. If there was another will, it couldn't have been Robert's doing. He'd been meticulous, almost obsessively so. Any change to his documents would have gone through Maurice, and Maurice would have told her, which meant someone else had interfered. By the time she reached her street, the unease had hardened into something sharper. This wasn't just Daniel and Marissa circling for advantage. There were other players in the game, ones she hadn't seen yet. That night, she poured herself a single glass of red wine and sat at the dining table with a legal pad. She began writing out the names of everyone with motive. Everyone who had access to Robert in the months before his death. Everyone who had a key to the safe, or influence over the family accountant. The list was longer than she liked. When the phone rang, she assumed it was Lucy calling to check in, but the voice on the other end was Maurice's, clipped and urgent. "I've started digging," he said. "And I've found something I wasn't expecting." His words cut clean through her composure. "Annabelle, this changes everything." The letter arrived, and inside it was a thread I hadn't anticipated, one that could unravel everything. The words sat on the page like a quiet detonation. "There are things about Robert's will you don't know." Annabelle read it again, slower this time, as if a second pass might reveal the missing pieces. A smudge, an initial, something human that could tell her who had sent it. But there was nothing. No folds in the paper beyond the one she'd made opening the envelope. No scent of ink. Just the machine-stamped neutrality of the typed line. She slipped it back into the envelope and sat still in the back seat, the hum of the engine blurring into the sound of her own pulse. If this was meant to rattle her, it was working, though not in the way the sender might have hoped. She wasn't panicked. She was calculating. By the time the driver pulled up to her gate, she'd made up her mind. She didn't even take off her coat before picking up the phone and dialing Maurice Keating, Robert's old lawyer, the one man she trusted to tell her the truth, without trimming it into something palatable. He answered on the fourth ring, voice rough with fatigue. "Annabelle, it's I've had a letter," she said. "Anonymous. It claims there are other things in Robert's will, things I don't know about." A pause on the line, and then the shift in his tone, alert, careful. "Do you still have it?" "I do." "Good. Don't destroy it. Don't dismiss it, either." She paced the kitchen as he spoke, her fingers trailing over the familiar ridges in the marble countertop. Maurice asked questions: how it was delivered, what the paper felt like, whether there were any identifying marks. When she told him there weren't, he went quiet for a long moment. "Annabelle," he said finally, "if there is another will, it changes everything. Even if it's invalid, the challenge alone could tie up the estate for years." Her hand tightened around the receiver. "So find out if there is one. I want every document Robert ever signed, every draft, every addendum, all of." "That will take time," he warned. "And if someone's gone to the trouble of keeping it from you, they'll fight to keep it hidden." She almost smiled. "Then they've underestimated me." After hanging up, she stood at the kitchen window, watching the frost creep across the grass under the moonlight. It wasn't lost on her that this letter could have come from anyone. Daniel, Marissa, someone in Marissa's family, even a relative of her own she hadn't thought about in years. The circle of trust was shrinking, and with it her patience. The next morning she hand-delivered the envelope to Maurice's office. His secretary tried to take it from her, but Annabelle shook her head. "Put it directly into his hands," she said, and the woman did. On the drive back, her thoughts moved like chess pieces. If there was another will, it couldn't have been Robert's doing. He'd been meticulous, almost obsessively so. Any change to his documents would have gone through Maurice, and Maurice would have told her which meant someone else had interfered. By the time she reached her street, the unease had hardened into something sharper. This wasn't just Daniel and Marissa circling for advantage. There were other players in the game, ones she hadn't seen yet. That night she poured herself a single glass of red wine and sat at the dining table with a legal pad. She began writing out the names of everyone with motive, everyone who had access to Robert in the months before his death, everyone who had a key to the safe or influence over the family accountant. The list was longer than she liked. When the phone rang, she assumed it was Lucy calling to check in, but the voice on the other end was Maurice's, clipped and urgent. "I've started digging," he said, "and I've found something I wasn't expecting." His words cut clean through her composure. "Annabelle, this changes everything. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was buried deep in family secrets." Maurice's words still echoed when Annabelle stepped into the conservatory the next afternoon. Glass walls caught the winter light, washing the room in a pale glare. Across the small table sat Margaret, Robert's cousin confidant, and someone Annabelle had trusted without question for decades. Maurice's research had pointed here. Too many coincidences, too much quiet access to Robert's affairs in his final months. Annabelle didn't waste time. "I know," she said simply, sliding a folder across the table. Inside, photocopies of the so-called hidden will side by side with Robert's real signature. Margaret's eyes flicked down, then up again quick as a knife. "I don't know what you think you're don't," Annabelle cut in. Her voice was low, steady. "The loops on the R are wrong. The flourish on the T in Parker. It's yours, Margaret. I've seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, charity pledges." The mask faltered. Margaret sat back, fingers curling around the armrest as if to anchor herself. For a long moment she said nothing. Then almost too softly, "I did it." The air thinned between them. Annabelle's pulse didn't quicken. Instead, a cold clarity settled in. "Why?" Margaret's gaze dropped to her lap. "Because when Robert died, I knew Marissa's family would push you out, and Daniel listens to them more than he should. I thought if I tied up part of the estate legally, I could make sure I wasn't left with nothing." Annabelle let the admission hang, its weight settling over the years of Sunday lunches, shared hospital vigils, whispered confidences in kitchen corners. "You forged my husband's name for your security," she said. "It wasn't a question. I thought I was protecting myself," Margaret whispered. "And maybe protecting you too. At least a little." The words might have carried more weight if Annabelle hadn't heard the tremor of self-preservation in them. She rose, slow and deliberate, letting the chair legs scrape against the tile. "You weren't protecting me. You were protecting your slice of the pie, and you risked everything to do it." Margaret straightened, some steel finding its way back into her spine. "And you've never done something ruthless to survive." Annabelle leaned forward, both hands on the table. Not at the expense of family, not by putting a knife in someone's back and calling it a safety net. The silence between them was jagged. Outside, a gardener's rake scratched faintly over gravel, each pull like a metronome counting down to the inevitable. Annabelle gathered the folder, tucking it into her bag. Her decision had already been made by the time she straightened her coat. I'm calling a family meeting. Everyone will hear this from me. And when they do, your name will be attached to every page of this mess. Margaret's face drained of color. If you do that, you'll blow the family apart. It's already been blown apart. Annabelle said, you just left the match burning on the table. She left the conservatory without another glance, the echo of her heels following her out into the hall. By the time she reached her car, she could already feel the strategy forming. This wouldn't be a private confrontation, hidden behind polite curtains. This needed light. Too much of this family's rot had thrived in the dark. Back at the house, she stood at her writing desk and began drafting the invitations. Urgent family meeting. Tomorrow. My home. Attendance required. No explanations. No apology. As the afternoon slid toward evening, she placed the final envelope into the outgoing mail stack. There was no turning back now. The next day, chairs scraped into a rough circle in her living room, faces she had known for a lifetime gathering with wary eyes. Annabelle took her place at the center, folder in hand, ready for the confrontation of a lifetime. The moment of truth was here, and it was time for everyone to face the consequences of their actions. The living room felt smaller than usual, the air too still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Chairs had been arranged in a wide circle, but the distance between them wasn't enough to keep tempers from colliding. Annabelle stood in the center, folder in one hand, the other resting lightly on the back of her chair. The winter light spilling through the bay window hit her crimson sleeve like a deliberate reminder she had chosen not to fade. She opened the folder, pulling out 2 sheets of paper. One was the genuine will Robert had signed in Maurice's office, the ink dark and deliberate. The other was the forgery. She didn't announce what they were right away. Instead, she held them up so everyone could see the subtle but damning differences. This, she said finally, her voice calm but carrying, is Robert's real signature. And this, she let the forged page hang for a beat, is what someone wanted you all to believe was his word. A murmur rippled around the room. Margaret sat rigid in her seat, eyes fixed on the rug. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. Marissa leaned back, her hands clasped in her lap, face unreadable except for the faint muscle working in her cheek. I know who forged it, Annabelle continued, and I know why. But this meeting isn't just about them. It's about the fact that this family has been willing to look the other way, as long as it kept certain people in control. Daniel straightened. Mother, you're making accusations that could stop. The word cut through the air like glass shattering. This isn't about what could happen, Daniel. It's about what has already happened. She laid the forged page on the coffee table, then placed the real will beside it. I have spent my entire adult life protecting this family's home, its name, and its future. I will not be written out, literally or figuratively, by anyone, not by strangers, and certainly not by my own blood. A few heads nodded. Lucy, seated near the window, murmured inaudible "good for you." Others looked anywhere but at Annabelle, unwilling to pick a side yet. Marissa spoke next, her tone measured but her eyes sharp. You're assuming Daniel had anything to do with this. I'm assuming nothing, Annabelle said. I'm telling you what I know. But if Daniel benefited from this fraud, and you did, Daniel, then whether you orchestrated it or not, you stood on ground you knew was not yours. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed again. He glanced toward Margaret, whose pale knuckles betrayed her grip on the chair arms. It was Ethan, from his place near the fireplace, who broke the silence. She's right. We've all watched this happen. Maybe we didn't know the details, but we knew something was wrong. That cracked the room open. One cousin spoke up about being excluded from estate discussions. An uncle admitted he'd been told not to complicate things, by siding with Annabelle. The more they spoke, the more the tide shifted. Annabelle let the voices rise for a moment before she lifted her hand. The room stilled. This is the line, she said. From this point forward, I will not be controlled, silenced or maneuvered. My rights, my legacy, they will be respected, and if that means taking this through the courts, I will do it. Margaret finally looked up, but whatever defense she might have formed dissolved under the weight of the room's attention. Daniel looked like a man trying to find the exit in a building where all the doors had locked. Marissa's composure was starting to crack. No one moved when Annabelle gathered the papers and slid them back into her folder. We settle this legally, Ethan said finally, his voice the closest thing to consensus the family had heard all day. Heads nodded, some reluctantly, some with quiet relief. Annabelle sat down at last, feeling the battle lines settle into place. The war wasn't over. It was only beginning. And now it would play out in court, where every secret risked being dragged into the light. The courtroom battle had begun, and I wasn't backing down. The oak-paneled courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and tension. Sunlight filtered through high windows, striping the long tables where counsel sat. Annabelle stood beside Maurice at the petitioner's table, her folder of documents neatly aligned in front of her like a soldier's kit. Across the aisle, Daniel and Marissa leaned toward their attorney, a sleek man in a charcoal suit whose cufflinks flashed every time he gestured. The clerk's voice echoed as the case was called. Parker Estate. Petitioner, Annabelle Parker. The judge, a woman with the calm severity of someone used to weathering storms from the bench, surveyed the room. Let's proceed. Maurice opened with precision. He laid out Robert's original will, the chain of custody, and the timeline leading to the discovery of the forgery. Every word was measured, his voice steady enough to lull until he landed on the sentence that shifted the air. The forged document was designed to remove my client from controlling interest in the estate. The opposing lawyer rose, smooth as silk. Your Honor, we dispute the authenticity claims. Further, there exists another version of the will, executed under legal counsel that supports my client's position. Annabelle's jaw tightened. Another version. The words carried weight, but Maurice didn't flinch. And we will show, Your Honor, that this so-called version was neither witnessed properly nor filed in accordance with probate law. What followed was less a conversation and more a volley, exhibits passed to the bench, signatures compared on monitors, procedural objections from both sides. Each objection was like a tiny skirmish in the larger war. When it was Annabelle's turn to testify, she stepped into the witness box with deliberate calm. Maurice asked the questions they'd rehearsed, each one designed to paint a clear picture of her role in building and maintaining the estate. She spoke of the years she and Robert spent restoring the house, of the businesses they ran to keep it solvent, of the countless family gatherings under its roof. When the opposing counsel cross-examined, his tone sharpened. Miss Parker, isn't it true that your relationship with your son has been strained for some time? She met his gaze without blinking. If strained means I won't be told where I can and can't stand in my own home, then yes. A few people in the gallery shifted, their discomfort palpable. Midway through the proceedings, Maurice presented the first surprise, a series of ledger entries showing money withdrawn from the estate's account in the months after Robert's death. The transactions led not to Daniel or Marissa, but to a trust in Margaret's name. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Margaret, seated behind Daniel, went still, her hands clenching in her lap. The judge leaned forward. We will address this in due course. Continue. By the second week of testimony, the fight had grown messier. More documents surfaced. A draft of the hidden will on a different letterhead, pages missing. A handwriting analyst testified about the forgery, confirming Annabelle's claims. But the defense struck back with affidavits from two witnesses swearing they'd seen Robert sign the alternate will. Annabelle studied their faces from the stand, trying to remember if Robert had ever mentioned them. He hadn't. The weight of it pressed on her some nights, alone at the kitchen table with Maurice's legal pad full of notes. The trial wasn't just about the estate anymore, it was about who Robert had trusted, and how easily that trust had been twisted. In court, family fault lines deepened. Some relatives avoided meeting her eyes as they left each day. Others squeezed her hand, murmuring encouragement. She could feel loyalty shifting like sand underfoot. On the morning of the third week, a new document appeared, one the defense claimed was a codicil to Robert's will. If accepted, it could alter everything. Maurice examined it with surgical focus, then whispered, "This could be a bluff, or it could be the knife they've been waiting to use." Annabelle sat straighter, then let them try. The judge, after hearing preliminary arguments, rapped her gavel once. "We will take a recess. Counsel, be prepared to address the codicil when we reconvene." As the court emptied, Annabelle felt the eyes of half the room on her, and knew that when they returned, the next move could decide whether she held her legacy or lost it forever. The judge's ruling was not what I expected, and it shook me to my core. The courtroom was colder than it had been all week. The wood benches creaked under the shifting weight of relatives, friends, and those who had chosen sides long before the first gavel struck. Annabelle sat at the petitioner's table, her fingers laced tightly, the folder of evidence in front of her like an anchor. The judge returned from chambers, robes swaying as she took her seat. The room hushed. Even the fluorescent hum above seemed to dim. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," the judge began, her tone precise, deliberate. "This includes the original will, the alleged codicil, and the testimony regarding the forgery." Annabelle's breath felt heavy in her chest. Maurice sat beside her, still as stone. Across the aisle, Daniel leaned forward, knuckles whitening on the edge of the table. Marissa's gaze flicked toward the gallery, as if searching for an exit route in a place with none. "The court finds," the judge continued, "that the document labeled as the alternate will is invalid. The signature is not that of Robert Parker." She paused, letting the words settle. A faint, stunned exhale escaped from Lucy in the back row. Annabelle didn't move, but a quiet heat began to spread through her chest, triumph threaded with vindication. Further, the judge said, "The so-called codicil is also inadmissible. Its lack of proper witnessing renders it void." Daniel's head dropped, his eyes narrowing into the table. Maurice's pen tapped once against his pad. "Control of the Parker estate," the judge went on, "is hereby returned to the petitioner, Annabelle Parker." Annabelle closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Robert's voice seemed to echo from some long hallway of memory. "It's ours, Annie. We built it." But the gavel didn't come down just yet. "However," the judge added, and the words sliced clean through the warmth in Annabelle's chest, "to resolve ongoing family disputes, and to prevent further depletion of estate resources through litigation, certain non-essential portions of the property are to be sold. Proceeds will be divided according to existing inheritance statutes." The air shifted. Annabelle's victory had been handed to her with a sharp edge, still attached. Daniel's lawyer straightened, but said nothing. Marissa leaned back, arms crossed, her mouth a thin brittle line. The gavel fell once. "Court is adjourned." Chairs scraped the floor. Papers rustled. Conversations began in low, clipped bursts. Annabelle rose, spine straight, walking past Daniel without meeting his eye. He muttered something under his breath, but she kept moving, the heels of her shoes striking the tile in measured beats. Outside, the winter sun was blinding. She stood for a moment at the top of the courthouse steps, breathing in the cold air as if it might wash away the months of stale tension. Maurice joined her, his voice low. "It's not everything we wanted, but it's more than they ever wanted you to have. It's enough," she said, though the word felt strange in her mouth. That evening she returned to the estate alone. The driveway crunched under her tires, the house looming in the dim light like an old sentinel. She walked through the front door and into the echoing hall, the scent of polished wood and faint lavender greeting her like an old friend. In the study she laid the folder on Robert's desk. Her hands moved across the worn grain, tracing the grooves made by years of writing, signing, planning. Pieces of the property would be gone soon, land sold, outbuildings cleared, but the heart of it would remain, and it would remain hers. She sat, pulling a clean notepad toward her. Plans began to form, repairs to the west wing, reopening the garden paths, maybe even hosting a community gala in Robert's name. The idea of shaping the estate's future on her own terms felt like a quiet rebellion against everything that had been done to erase her. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, making the glass tremble. She barely noticed until a shadow moved across the threshold of the study. She looked up. In the doorway stood a man she hadn't seen in over 20 years, someone whose name she had not spoken since before Robert's death. He smiled faintly as if no time had passed at all. "Hello, Annabelle, we need to talk about Robert. The family had tried to take everything from me, but I was taking back what was mine." Annabelle didn't stand when the man in the doorway spoke Robert's name. She stayed seated in Robert's chair, letting the leather creak beneath her, and studied him. 20 years had carved deep lines into his face, but his mouth held the same measured set she remembered, cautious, calculating. "I don't recall inviting you in," she said. His smile was thin as old paper. "I didn't think I needed an invitation." Too much history hung in that answer. She refused to give him the satisfaction of chasing it. Instead, she rose and crossed to the window, where the winter gardens stretched out in pale light. The court had given the estate back to her, its title, its walls, its heartbeat, and she intended to shape its future on her own terms. The days that followed were a quiet, relentless campaign. She moved through the West Wing with a clipboard, noting repairs the family had neglected, plaster split in the ballroom ceiling, warped floorboards, overgrown orchards choking themselves to death. She made calls to local craftsmen, stone masons, iron workers. When Daniel rang, his voice careful, she listened but offered nothing in return. He and Marissa wanted to find a way forward. She told him they could speak when the time was right, then ended the call before nostalgia could soften her resolve. Forgiveness would not come with a single conversation. Trust had to be rebuilt brick by brick, like the house itself, and under her direction alone. By the third week, a larger vision had taken root, something beyond repairs. The Parker estate would host an annual gathering, not a parade of control and quiet rivalries, but a day for the family to remember where they came from. Tables under the oak trees, Robert's name carved into a stone arch, children running across the lawn without being told they didn't belong. Lucy was the first she told. They walked the east terrace in the biting wind, as Annabelle described it. "It could work," Lucy said. "They won't have a choice," Annabelle replied. She began calling her children Daniel's sisters, the far-flung cousins. Some were wary, some hopeful, but most sounded relieved at the idea of gathering without legal summons attached. Each step forward seemed to breathe life back into the house. Sunlight felt warmer through the tall windows. The floors seemed surer beneath her feet, and yet progress was shadowed by Maurice's ongoing investigation into the forgery. One evening he came to the study with a slim file. His expression was neutral, but his voice carried a weight that tightened the air. "I've confirmed something," he said, placing the folder on Robert's desk. The handwriting analysis. Margaret didn't act alone. In fact, the primary hand in the forgery. He paused, as if measuring how much to drop at once. Annabelle opened the file. Clipped inside were handwriting samples beside the report. Neat loops, deliberate strokes, too familiar to mistake. It wasn't Daniel's, not Marissa's, not even Margaret's. It was someone far closer. Someone whose letters she'd kept in a box upstairs. Someone whose name she had once signed alongside her own on school forms and family Christmas cards. Her chest tightened, not with rage, but with the deep, slow ache of betrayal. She closed the folder and set it aside. "I see," Maurice hesitated. "What will you do?" Her voice was calm, but it cut the space between them cleanly. "What I've always done, face them head on." That night she opened her calendar and wrote a single line for the next morning. Confrontation, 9 a.m. The name beside it was the last one she had ever expected to write in that context. The final confrontation would reveal the truth, and it was more painful than I ever imagined. The morning light came cold through the study windows, glinting off the edge of the brass clock on Robert's desk. 9 o'clock was creeping closer, each tick falling heavier than the last. When the doorbell rang, the sound echoed through the hall like a summons. Annabelle opened the door to find him standing there, her brother Thomas. He looked almost exactly as he had in her memories, only grayer at the temples. The swagger in his stance dulled into something harder, more defensive. "Come in," she said, the words flat. He stepped inside, eyes sweeping the foyer with a casualness that felt deliberate, like he was taking inventory of what was still hers. They met in the drawing room, where the morning sun painted sharp rectangles across the carpet. Annabelle didn't offer coffee, didn't offer a seat. She stood by the mantel, folder in hand, the pages inside already a verdict. "You forged Robert's name," she said, skipping preamble. Thomas's jaw flexed, but he didn't feign ignorance. "You weren't supposed to find out." Her grip on the folder tightened. Maurice found the handwriting match. The loops, the spacing, your hand, Thomas. Not Margaret's. Not anyone else's. Yours. He looked at her for a long beat, then shrugged with a kind of weary resignation. "You've always acted like this place was yours alone. Robert might have left it to you, but it's our family's estate. I was making sure it stayed in the blood. By cutting me out of it." Her voice sharpened. "You were never going to share. Not with me, not with anyone." Daniel and Marissa saw it too. "Your grip on this place is iron." Her chest ached, not from his words, but from the years they represented. "You could have come to me, and you would have said no." The simplicity of it was almost laughable. He had decided her answer before she'd even been given the chance to give it. Annabelle took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "Do you have any idea what you've cost this family? The legal battles, the damage. Robert's name dragged through court because you couldn't be bothered to speak to me like a brother." Thomas's gaze faltered. "I thought I was protecting what mattered." Her voice was ice. "You were protecting your place at the table. Don't dress it up as loyalty." He didn't deny it. Instead, he glanced toward the tall windows, as if the sight of the gardens might soften the moment. "Maybe I went too far," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for it to get ugly." "It got ugly the second you picked up a pen and pretended to be him," she said. Silence stretched between them, heavy with things that could never be undone. Finally he said, "I'm sorry." The words fell flat, too small to fill the chasm between them. Annabelle let them hang in the air, but didn't take them in. "I'll accept your apology," she said evenly, "but I will never trust you again." His eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time she saw something like regret there. But it was too late. "This house, this estate, my life, it will not be run by anyone's agenda but mine," she said, her tone final. Thomas nodded once, almost like a soldier acknowledging defeat, and then turned for the door. When it shut behind him, the quiet was immense. Annabelle stood in it for a moment, letting the truth settle. She had survived the worst of it. The battles were fought, the estate was hers, and the people who had tried to take it from her had failed. She walked back into the study, resting her hands on Robert's desk. The view through the window seemed wider now, the gardens more open. For the first time in months, she could think about the future without the shadow of a fight hanging over it. On the desk lay her notepad, the list of plans she had begun, restorations, the family gathering, the gala in Robert's name. She picked up her pen, adding a new heading, next chapter. Her eyes lingered on the words. The hardest part was over. That afternoon she began packing a small case, not to leave the estate for good, but to step away for the first time in years. Somewhere beyond these walls, her new life was waiting. "I wasn't just reclaiming an estate, I was reclaiming my freedom." The morning she left, frost clung to the edges of the garden like lace. Annabelle stood on the terrace with her small case beside her, the air crisp enough to sting her cheek. The house loomed behind her, its windows catching the pale light, the stones weathered but solid, hers again in every sense that mattered. She didn't glance back as the driver loaded her bag. This trip wasn't an escape, it was an arrival. She had fought for these walls, yes, but she had fought harder for herself. The countryside blurred past, each mile unspooling the tension she had carried for years. By the time the car stopped at a quiet seaside inn, the weight in her chest had shifted, no longer a stone but something lighter, looser. The days there fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for walking the tide line, the sea air tangling in her hair. Afternoons for the little studio she set up by the window, paintbrush in hand, a jar of wildflowers on the sill. Evenings for writing, sometimes letters she never sent, sometimes memories that spilled onto the page with unexpected warmth. She found herself tending small gardens behind the inn, coaxing life from soil that had lain dormant for too long. It was grounding, the slow patience of it. When she finally returned to the estate weeks later, it was with a mind uncluttered. She moved through the rooms without the old heaviness, seeing not the echoes of conflict, but the possibilities of the life ahead. Daniel came first, unannounced, holding a bottle of wine like a peace offering. They spoke in the library, the fire casting long shadows across the shelves. He apologized without prompting, the words awkward but earnest. She listened, neither dismissing him nor granting immediate forgiveness. Trust, she reminded herself, was built slowly, not restored in a single evening. Over time, other family members began to visit, not to pry, not to scheme, but to sit in the kitchen over tea, to walk the gardens, to share a meal without the undercurrent of strategy. Annabel made it clear, these were her terms, her invitations, her table. The estate changed with her. The neglected orchards were cleared and replanted. The ballroom ceiling was restored, its plaster gleaming once more. She held the first of her planned gatherings in the gardens that spring, tables draped in white linen, children darting between the hedges, laughter carrying up to the stone arch where Robert's name was carved. Standing there, she realized something that took her by surprise. The property, for all its history, was not her true legacy. That lived in the choices she had made, in the refusal to be erased, in the unshakable fact that she had rebuilt her life from the inside out. On quiet evenings she would sit by the window in Robert's study, now simply her study, watching the last light fade over the lawns. She painted, she wrote, she planted seeds that would bloom in seasons to come, and she kept a locked drawer in the desk, not for documents, but for reminders, small tokens of the battles she'd won, and the strength they had demanded. Spring turned to summer, the house and gardens alive with color. The air no longer carried the chill of old grudges. It was hers, all of it, the home, the work, the peace. One evening, as the last guests from a garden supper drifted toward the drive, Annabel lingered at the gate, her hands resting lightly on the wrought iron. The moon was rising, silvering the path ahead. For the first time in years there was no plan to make, no fight to prepare for, just the quiet certainty that she could walk into whatever came next without hesitation. She smiled, not for anyone watching, but for herself. Fade out on Annabel standing at the garden gate beneath the moonlight, the estate glowing warmly behind her, her legacy intact, her freedom absolute.